Hi, my name is Luis, and I'll be talking about server-side web applications with Node.js. Okay, so what is it? Node is an asynchronous, event-driven, server-side JavaScript interpreter. That's right, it's a server-side interpreter. And I know you're probably used to thinking of JavaScript as a client-side technology, but with Node you can run it on the server side too. And it uses Chrome's V8 implementation of ECMA5. Although it does include some ECMA6 features, as we will see soon. Node's great because you can use the same language on the front end and the back end of your system. And that makes it a lot easier for your developers. Node's very fast. You can read more about that on your own. And it's very easy to scale it to a lot of users with relatively little effort. And finally, it includes a package manager, which makes things incredibly easy to use, and we'll see more about that in a bit. So, in what kind of situations would you not use Node? Well, when you have a CPU-intensive application that doesn't make a lot of use of user input and output, then it wouldn't make much sense to use it. It's kind of like using a Prius in an off-road terrain. Okay, and now you probably want to see a little bit about Node, so I'll get right into it. Go ahead and clone this repository, and we'll see an example of how it works in just a second. Okay, well, let's get started and clone that repo down. So our application is going to be a to-do service where people will be able to submit text through a form, an HTML form, and have their to-do list stored on the server side and then displayed back on the browser. So I've cloned this application down here, and I should be able to open it here in Sublime in the starter code section. We'll see we've got 3 files, and we'll explain them all in a second. But for now, let's just look at package.json. This is the file that is present in all Node projects, and it contains metadata about the project that helps the Node package manager I talked about earlier to do lots of things like run tests, and for our purposes specifically to install dependencies. So if you look down here, we have a dependency on Express and a dependency on Swig. And in order to install those dependencies, we go to our code folder, here's the starter code, and we run npm install. And that tells Node Package Manager to look at the package.json file and look at the dependencies, see what's installed, and what's missing, install it. So you can see here we installed Swig and Express. And it stores them here in Node modules. So that's a cool thing about Node that's very helpful. So back to our code. This is our main file, index.js, and this is what's going to be running on the server side of things. So if you're familiar with Python's simple HTTP server, that's an example of a similar server-side service. But instead of using Python, we're using Node, and this is our server file. So we're using Express and Swig, and you import them in Node using this require function. And this function is injected into your Node application by Node. Similarly, this __ dir name variable is injected into the application as well. Everything else we've defined on our own. So this stuff is not of a lot of importance. It's kind of just boilerplate overhead from Swig and Express. And Express is a web server framework that just kind of streamlines things for web development. It's a very common framework. And Swig is a service that can render HTML templates. So you could just return strings and manually write strings to this response object and have them written back to the user, but that's very tedious and it's not an efficient way to do things. So instead, we're saying that our templates are being stored in this templates folder here, which is where our to-do HTML file is, and then we're rendering that to-do HTML file and putting it into a response object and returning it to the user when they request the home or the slash path of our website. And then we're running our server on localhost port 8000. And you can see this string here is a little janky, and that's because Node supports, partially supports ECMA 6, which is the newest version of JavaScript, which came out in June 2015. And this is one of the new features in ECMA 6. It's string templating. So here we're indicating that we're putting this variable port into a string using this $ bracket syntax. We'll see some more ECMA syntax later on in the video. Okay. So now that we're rendering this to do HTML file, let's check it out and see if it works. So the way you run your Node server is you say node and then the name of your file. So you run it, and then here you can see that we're running on localhost. So let's check it out. Whoops, wrong URL. There we go. There's our list. Here's our form. I've provided this all for you. Of course, none of this actually works yet, and we'll get to that in a second. So just viewing the HTML real quick, it's clean, normal HTML, nothing tricky about it. I've hard-coded a HTML list, and I've created a form, and you can see that this form has an action. So when you submit it, it'll submit the form to /add-item, which we haven't defined yet, but we will. And it submits the item, name equals item. Okay. So now that you can see that we're rendering this HTML, we'll show you the benefit of doing this. So if you define variables in your JavaScript server code, in your Node code, you can put them inside your template. And this will help us because we don't want to hard code our list in here. That wouldn't make any sense. We want to dynamically render this list, render this HTML with our list in it, and then return it to the user. And this is different than what you might do in Angular, because in Angular you might use partials or models to manipulate the DOM, but that is happening on the client side. What Node is doing is happening on the server side. So we're rendering the HTML and then passing that entirely to the user. So what we really want to do is we want to create a for loop here, right? So what you might do in Angular with ng repeat, what you can do in Swig is a for loop. So you can say for item in list, for each item in our list, and then we've got to end our for loop. We're going to want to say list item, right? And then we can get rid of all these other tags. Now we got to supply this list array to our template, and we do that inside our application here. So you do that by passing a second argument to the render function of response that is an object that contains key value pairs of variables that are going to be added to the scope of our template. So we defined a list array here. So we're saying our list is going to be equal to 1, 2, 3. Okay. So let's just restart our server and check it out. There it is. Our HTML is being rendered on the server side, and in order for you to see that, we'll check it out by looking at the source code. So if you look at this, you can see that there's no ng repeat that we're seeing in our source code. There's no Angular stuff. This is all clean, normal HTML that is generated on the server side and then returned to the user. So now we need a way to capture the input from this form. So when I say walk the dog and submit the form, I should be redirected to our page, and that new to-do list item should be added to our form. So we're going to need to create a new route, and we're going to route to this /add item page that our form is routing to. And this routing mechanism, if you're familiar with Angular, is just another implementation of the model view controller methodology, where this is our controller code, this is our view code, and our model is just our data. So like here. Okay, so we're going to render the same template, and we're gonna pass in another list. And for simplicity, I'm going to define our list out here. I'm going to pass it into both controllers. And then what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to here read the form input and add it to our list. And the way you do that with Express in Node is you call the request object and look at the query object, which will contain our item. And it's called item because we named it item here in our form. Our input is named is item. And if you look over here at the two functions, the two variables in our function that our controller is defining is the request object and the response object. And it makes sense that one of them contains the metadata about the request coming in from the user, so the input, and the other one contains metadata with the actual response that the server is returning to the user. So we're taking our input, reading it, using it to create our response, and then returning it to the user. Okay, so now we've got our item here, and we're going to want to add it to that to-do list. So we're going to say to-do.push item. So it's going to get added to the array, and then we're going to re-render the HTML. So let's restart our script and see if it works. So we start it, our list goes away because we initialize it to be empty. But when I say hey and I submit it, you can see in the URL link that we were redirected to the /item route, and the item equals hey argument was passed in, which our controller read and added to the to-do array, and then it rendered our template with that array and then returned it to the user. And there are a couple kinks that you might notice in this, like if you keep pressing submit, or you submit the same thing twice, it'll still submit it. And there are some things that you can do to fix that, and if you want to check that out, look at the finished code. But other than that, enjoy your newfound knowledge of Node. Thank you.